Picture yourself standing in a store in the year 1935. It's the middle of the Great Depression. In front of you is something you need. Maybe it's a refrigerator, maybe a winter coat for your kid, maybe a set of tires so you can keep driving to the only job you've got. And here's the problem. You don't have the money. Not today, not this week. There is no credit card in your wallet because credit cards do not exist yet. They will not exist for another 15 years. So what do? Do you just walk away empty-handed? Do you go home and tell your family, sorry, we'll have to wait until we've saved up? Most people, when they imagine America before credit cards, picture exactly that. A simpler, more disciplined country, a place where if you couldn't afford something, you simply didn't buy it. A nation of thrifty savers who paid cash, kept out of debt, and only bought what they'd earned. It's a comforting picture, and politicians and commentators love to hold it up as a lost golden age of financial responsibility. If only we could go back to the way things used to be, before all this plastic, before all this debt. But here's the thing, that picture is almost entirely a myth. Americans did not wait until 1950 to start buying things they couldn't afford. They had been doing it for 100 years before the first credit card was ever printed. They bought on the tab at the general store. They bought sewing machines and pianos and cars on the installment plan. They pawned their watches. They borrowed from loan sharks who charged rates that would make a modern payday lender blush. They put coats on layaway. They carried little metal charge plates in their purses. The truth is that the entire history of the modern American economy is, in large part, the history of finding cleverer and cleverer ways to let ordinary people buy what they could not yet pay for. And when you actually trace that history, when you follow it from the sewing machine to the loan shark to the department store charge plate to that famous dinner in a New York restaurant in 1950, you discover something genuinely surprising. The credit card did not begin America's love affair with debt. It was the climax of it. It was the final product of a transformation that had been building for a century, a transformation that quietly rewired the American conscience, that took a country which once viewed debt as a moral failing and turned it into the most credit-dependent society the world has ever seen. And almost nobody noticed it happening because it happened one small, reasonable-sounding step at a time. So let me take you back and tell you the real story of how Americans bought what they couldn't afford long before the credit card. It's a story about money, yes, but it's really a story about morality, about shame, about desire, and about the people who figured out how to profit from all three. Let's start with the world we've forgotten, the moral world of debt in the 19th century. For most of American history, borrowing money was not just financially risky. It was considered shameful. Debt carried a genuine moral stain. The Protestant culture that shaped early America prized thrift, self-denial, and living within your means. To be in debt was to be dependent, and to be dependent was to be less than fully a man, less than fully respectable. People quoted Shakespeare at each other, "Neither a borrower nor a lender be," as though it were scripture. Benjamin Franklin filled his almanacs with proverbs about the dangers of owing money. A man who fell into debt might find himself not just poor, but disgraced. And in the worst cases, in the early years, actually imprisoned for it. But, and this is the first crack in the Golden Age myth, the reality on the ground was always messier than the sermons. Because even in that supposedly thrifty world, credit was everywhere. It just didn't look like what we call credit today. Go into a small-town general store in 1870, and you would find something called the book, or the tab, or open book credit. The storekeeper knew every family in town. He knew who was honest, who was going through a hard patch, whose crop had failed. So when a farmer needed flour and salt and nails but wouldn't have cash until the harvest came in, the storekeeper simply wrote it down in a ledger. You'd settle up when you could. This was informal, personal, built entirely on reputation and trust. And it was absolutely a form of buying what you couldn't afford. The whole rural economy ran on it. The Gilded Age humorist Mark Twain captured the spirit perfectly when he mocked the era's obsession with what he sarcastically called beautiful credit, describing a man boasting on the street, "I wasn't worth a cent 2 years ago, and now I owe $2 million. So the idea that Americans were once a nation of pure cash-paying savers is wrong from the very beginning. What was true is that credit was informal, local, and moralized. You could get it, but it depended on who you were and who knew you. And that entire system was about to be blown wide open by, of all things, a machine for sewing clothes. In the 1850s, a flamboyant, semi-literate, and frankly unscrupulous inventor named Isaac Singer had built the first truly practical sewing machine. It was a marvel. It could transform the brutal, endless labor of hand sewing a family's clothes into something manageable. There was just one problem. It cost about $100. And in a country where the average family earned less than $500 a year, $100 was an impossible sum. It was a fortune. Singer had built a machine that most of the people who wanted it could never afford to buy. And here is where Singer's business partner, a sharp lawyer named Edward Clark, made a decision that would change American life more than the sewing machine itself. Clark looked at the problem and asked a different question. Not, how do we make this cheaper, but how do we let people pay for it over time? He introduced what was called the hire purchase plan. A customer could take the machine home for a small down payment, just $5, and then pay it off in monthly installments of $5 until it was theirs. And if they missed their payments, the company simply came and repossessed the machine. It was, as far as anyone can tell, the first true installment plan in American history. And Singer marketed it with an irresistible slogan, $1 down and $1 a week. Now watch what this did, because it's subtle and it's enormous. Suddenly, a working family that could never save up $100 could have the machine now, today, and pay for it out of the money it saved by having it. The item paid for itself while you used it. And there was something almost magical about the psychology of it. A magazine of the era, Scientific American, remarked with genuine puzzlement in the 1850s on a strange fact. Customers seemed to actually prefer paying $100 slowly in little weekly bites over paying $50 in cash all at once, even when they had the $50 in their pocket. The pain of parting with a large sum felt worse than the total cost of many small ones. Singer and Clark had stumbled onto one of the deepest truths of consumer psychology, one that every credit card company on earth still exploits today. People don't experience the price. They experience the payment. The installment plan spread like wildfire from there. If you could sell sewing machines this way, why not pianos? Why not furniture? Why not encyclopedias and farm equipment and stoves? Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the installment plan crept into more and more of American life. And with every product it touched, it chipped away a little more at that old moral wall against debt. Because how shameful could borrowing really be if respectable, hardworking families were doing it to buy a sewing machine so mother could clothe the children? The installment plan didn't just sell goods, it sold a new idea. The idea that going into debt for the right things, for productive things, for the family's benefit, wasn't a vice at all. It was smart. It was modern. It was the responsible thing to do. But installment credit had a crucial limitation, and understanding that limitation is the key to the darker chapter of this story. The installment plan let you buy a specific object. The furniture company would happily finance your sofa, because if you stopped paying, they could come take the sofa back. The object itself was the security, but what happened when what you needed wasn't a sofa? What happened when you needed cash? When the rent was due, or the doctor had to be paid, or you'd lost your job and needed to get through the month. You couldn't put groceries on an installment plan. You couldn't finance a rent payment. For that, an ordinary working person in America around 1900 needed to borrow actual money. And that is where the story gets grim, because here is a fact that shatters the golden age myth completely. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, banks did not lend money to ordinary working people, full stop. Banks were for businesses, for the wealthy, for merchants and industrialists. The idea of a bank making a small personal loan to a factory worker or a washerwoman was almost unheard of. It was considered beneath them, not worth the trouble, and probably not respectable. So when a working family hit a cash emergency, and working families hit cash emergencies constantly, they had almost nowhere legitimate to turn. They had a few options, and none of them were good. They could borrow from relatives or neighbors if they had any who weren't just as broke. They could go to the pawn shop, handing over a wedding ring or a winter coat or the tools of their trade in exchange for a fraction of its value, hoping to buy it back before it was sold. Or, and this is the one that really defined the era, they could go to the loan shark. The loan sharks of that period were not the mobsters of the movies, at least not at first. They were often respectable-looking businessmen operating in plain sight, and they were known as salary lenders. Their business was brutally simple. They would lend a desperate worker a small sum, say $10 or $20, secured not by any object, but by a claim on the borrower's future wages, a wage assignment. And the interest rates were staggering. Not the 6 or 8% a year that a bank might charge a business, but rates that could work out to 200, 300, even 400% a year. A worker who borrowed a few dollars to cover an emergency could find himself trapped, paying interest week after week, month after month, never touching the principal, effectively handing over a chunk of every paycheck to the lender forever. Records from the period describe men who borrowed $30 and were still paying on that same $30 2 years later, having paid back many times what they'd borrowed and still owing the full amount. This was the reality of consumer credit for the American working class. Not thrift, not cash on the barrelhead, debt bondage hidden in the shadows of every industrial city. And this problem got so bad, so widespread, so socially corrosive, that it triggered one of the strangest and most important reform movements you've probably never heard of. Its unlikely hero was a philanthropic organization called the Russell Sage Foundation, established in 1907 with a fortune left behind by a railroad tycoon. The foundation looked at the loan shark epidemic and reached a conclusion that was, for its time, almost heretical. They decided that the problem was not that poor people were borrowing money. The problem was that there was no legal, honest way for them to do it, as long as the law capped interest rates at levels that made small loans unprofitable for legitimate lenders. The foundation argued the only people willing to make those loans would be criminals, and they would charge whatever they wanted in the dark. So the Russell Sage Foundation did something counterintuitive. They campaigned to legalize higher interest rates. In 1916, they drafted a model law called the Uniform Small Loan Law, and its logic was this: create a new class of licensed, regulated lenders, allow them to charge more than a bank could, up to about 3.5% a month, roughly 42% a year, which sounds high but was a fraction of what the loan sharks charged. In exchange, force them to follow strict rules, disclose their terms, and operate in the open. The idea was to flood the small loan market with what the reformers called honest capital, to drive the loan sharks out of business not by banning lending, but by outcompeting them with something better. State by state, through the 19-teens and 20s, the law spread. And it worked more or less. It gave birth to the modern consumer finance company, the storefront, personal loan business, and it dragged small dollar lending out of the criminal underworld and into the light of regulation. It's a fascinating and largely forgotten episode, an early admission by American society of a truth we still wrestle with today, that the demand of ordinary people to borrow money is so powerful, so fundamental, that you cannot make it go away. You can only choose who gets to satisfy it. And notice what all of this means for our Golden Age myth. By the time we reach the 1920s, the supposedly thrifty, debt-free America has in reality developed a sprawling ecosystem of consumer credit. The installment plan for buying things, pawn shops and licensed lenders and finance companies for borrowing cash, a whole culture quietly learning, product by product, loan by loan, that debt was a normal part of getting by and even of getting ahead. The moral wall was crumbling. And then in the 1920s, it didn't just crumble, it was deliberately demolished by the most powerful industry in America, the automobile industry. The car changed everything about consumer credit because the car was the perfect storm. It was expensive, far more than a sewing machine. It was mass-produced, which meant there were suddenly millions of them that needed to be sold. And crucially, everyone wanted one. It was the defining object of desire of the age. So the question that had faced Singer with his sewing machines now faced the entire auto industry, but at a colossal scale. How do you sell a $500 or $1,000 machine to a nation of people who earn a couple $1,000s a year? And here the two titans of the industry split, and their split tells you everything. Henry Ford, a moralist who genuinely hated debt, refused to finance his cars on credit. Instead, he offered what he called a weekly purchase plan, which was really a form of what we call layaway. You would pay money into an account at the Ford dealership a few dollars a week, and once you had saved up the full price, you got your car. Save first, then buy. It was the thrifty, old-fashioned way, and it was true to Ford's stern values. General Motors, his great rival, made the opposite choice. In 1919, GM created a company called the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, GMAC, whose entire purpose was to lend people the money to buy a GM car right now and pay it off over time. Drive the car today, pay while you drive. You already know who won. Americans overwhelmingly chose GM's plan. They did not want to save for a year and then get the car. They wanted the car now in the driveway in front of the neighbors, and they were perfectly willing to pay for the privilege of having it sooner. GM's embrace of installment credit helped propel it past Ford to become the largest car maker in the world, and it taught corporate America a lesson it would never forget. The company that lets people buy now beats the company that makes them wait, almost every single time. Ford eventually caved and started financing cars too. He had to. The morale of thrift lost to the logic of the sale, and once the floodgates were open with cars, they opened for everything. The 1920s became the first great age of American consumer credit, and it fused perfectly with the other great force of the decade, mass advertising. Radios, refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, phonographs, all the shiny new products of the industrial age were suddenly available on easy monthly payments. A small down payment and easy terms, the ads sang. By the end of the decade, an enormous share of America's consumer durables, most of the cars, a huge fraction of the furniture and appliances and radios were being bought on installment credit. And advertising did the moral work, completing the transformation that had started with a sewing machine 70 years earlier. Debt was no longer whispered about with shame. It was celebrated. It was reframed as the enlightened tool of the modern, forward-looking household. Why deny your family the good things in life today when you could have them now and pay as you go? Thrift, the old supreme virtue, started to look almost quaint, even a little foolish. A whole generation was being taught gently and relentlessly that the responsible thing, the aspirational thing, the American thing was to buy now and pay later. But there was a bill coming due, and it came due in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Because this is the part of the story that most celebrations of consumer credit skip right over. All that installment debt of the 1920s, all those easy monthly payments, rested on a single fragile assumption that people would keep earning their wages month after month so they could keep making those payments. And in 1929, in the years that followed, that assumption shattered. The stock market crashed, the banks failed, and unemployment climbed toward 1 in 4 workers. And suddenly, millions of American families who had bought their cars and furniture and radios on time could no longer make the payments. The consequences rippled outward and made everything worse. When people stopped paying, the goods were repossessed, so families lost not just their savings, but the very things they'd gone into debt to buy. Companies that had extended all that credit found their customers unable to pay, which strained them further. And here's the vicious part. When your paycheck is already committed to paying off debts on things you bought years ago, you have no money to buy anything new. Consumer spending, which the credit boom had inflated to dizzying heights, collapsed. The very system that had powered the roaring prosperity of the 20s now helped to deepen and prolong the misery of the 30s. Economists still debate exactly how much consumer debt contributed to causing the Depression, but there's little doubt it made the downturn more brutal. The credit machine that had felt like magic on the way up felt like a trap on the way down. And that trauma reshaped how Americans handled credit for the next decade. Chastened, cautious, and often burned, Many people turned back towards safer ways of buying, and the great symbol of that shift was layaway. Layaway is the mirror image of the installment plan, and it's important to understand the difference. With an installment plan, you take the item home first and pay it off afterward, going into debt to do it. With layaway, the store holds the item for you while you pay it off in advance, and you only take it home once it's fully paid for. No debt, no interest, no risk of repossession, because you never had the thing in the first place. During the Depression, with people terrified of debt and stores desperate to make any sale at all, layaway boomed. It let a cash-strapped family reserve that coat or that Christmas gift in October and pay it off a little at a time, walking out with it in December, having borrowed nothing. It was buying what you couldn't yet afford, but doing it the careful way, the way that couldn't blow up in your face. For a generation scarred by repossession, that safety was worth the wait. But even as layaway flourished, another quieter innovation was taking shape in the nation's department stores, and this one points directly at the future. To keep their best customers loyal and spending, big stores had begun offering charge accounts. If you were a known, reliable customer, the store would let you charge your purchases throughout the month and send you a single bill. And to keep track of it all, they developed a clever little device called the charge plate. It was a small rectangle of metal, a bit like a military dog tag stamped with your name and address and account number. When you made a purchase, the clerk would run it through a machine that imprinted your details onto the sales slip. If you've ever heard the old-fashioned ka-chunk of an imprinting machine, that sound was born here. The charge plate spread through department stores in the 1930s, and around the same time, other businesses got the same idea. Oil companies issued cards so drivers could buy gasoline without carrying cash. Hotels issued cards to their regular guests. These were the true ancestors of the credit card, and they matter enormously to our story. But notice their limitations, because those limitations are exactly what the credit card would eventually overcome. Every one of these early cards and plates worked at only one company, or at best within one industry. Your Macy's charge plate worked at Macy's, and nowhere else. Your Shell gas card bought Shell gasoline and nothing else. And almost all of them were what we'd call charge cards, not credit cards. You had to pay your balance in full at the end of every month. They were a convenience, a way to avoid carrying cash and to consolidate your bills, but they were not really a tool for long-term borrowing. If you wanted to buy something at the department store and pay it off over 6 months, you still needed a separate installment plan. The pieces of the modern system existed, but they were scattered. Installment credit over here, charge plates over there, personal loans somewhere else. What nobody had yet done was combine them into a single object, a card that you could use at many different unrelated businesses and that let you borrow, not just defer, but actually borrow, carrying a balance over time. That final leap, the one that ties this whole 100-year story together, happened at a dinner in New York City in the winter of 1950. The story, as it's usually told, is charming. A businessman named Frank McNamara was dining at a Manhattan restaurant called Major's Cabin Grill when the check came and he reached for his wallet and, to his horror, realized he'd left it at home. His wife had to come rescue him and pay the bill. Humiliated, McNamara supposedly resolved never to be caught in that situation again. And from that embarrassment, the entire credit card industry was born. It's a great story. And here's the thing you should know about it. It's largely a myth. One of McNamara's own partners, a man named Matty Simmons, admitted years later that the forgotten wallet tale was mostly a piece of marketing, a founding legend polished up to give the company a charming origin. The real motivation was simpler and more familiar. McNamara and his partners, Ralph Schneider and Alfred Bloomingdale, saw a business opportunity. And it's worth pausing on that because it fits the whole pattern of this history. Even the birth of the credit card comes wrapped in a comforting myth, a nice, tidy story that hides a more calculating reality underneath. Whatever the true inspiration, in February of 1950, McNamara and Schneider launched the Diners Club, and in doing so, they invented something genuinely new. The Diners Club card, a simple piece of cardboard, could be used to pay at a whole collection of different unaffiliated restaurants, 27 of them in New York to start. Here's how it worked and why it was revolutionary. The cardholder would eat at any participating restaurant and sign for the meal. The restaurant would send the bill to Diners Club. Diners Club would pay the restaurant, keeping a fee of around 7% for itself, and then bill the cardholder at the end of the month. For the first time, a third party had inserted itself between the buyer and dozens of different sellers, handling the credit for all of them at once. It wasn't the store lending to you anymore, the way Singer or the department stores had. It was a separate company whose entire business was extending credit and getting paid to do it. Diners Club grew explosively, from a couple hundred members to tens of thousands within a year, and it started charging an annual fee for the privilege. In 1958, the venerable American Express Company launched its own card on the same model. The Universal Multi-Merchant Charge Card had arrived. But there was still one more piece missing, the single most consequential piece of all, and it fell into place later that same year, 1958, in the unlikely city of Fresno, California. Bank of America, then the largest bank in the state, took the Diners Club concept and added the one ingredient that would truly change the world: revolving credit. Instead of requiring you to pay your balance in full at the end of every month, Bank of America's new card, called the Bank AmeriCard, let you carry a balance from one month to the next. You could pay just a portion of what you owed, and the bank would charge you interest on the rest. This was the fusion at last. It combined the go-anywhere convenience of the Diners Club card with the pay-over-time borrowing of the old installment plan, all in a single card in your pocket. It was the installment plan and the charge plate and the personal loan finally merged into one object, usable almost anywhere. And the way they launched it was audacious to the point of recklessness. In an event now remembered as the Fresno Drop in September of 1958, Bank of America simply mailed out 60,000 of these cards, already active, already carrying a $300 line of credit to people in Fresno who had never asked for them. Unsolicited live credit cards arriving in people's mailboxes like manna from the sky. It caused chaos, fraud, and delinquency at first, and the early years were a financial disaster for the bank. But the fundamental idea was too powerful to fail. Bank of America expanded the program across California and eventually licensed it to banks across the country. That little card from Fresno, the Bank AmeriCard, would in time be renamed. Today we call it Visa. And a competing alliance of banks launched their own version in 1966 called Master Charge, which you now know as MasterCard. The modern credit card, and with it the modern American economy of debt, was born. So let's come all the way back to the question we started with. How did Americans buy what they couldn't afford before credit cards? And now you can see that the question itself contains a hidden false assumption, the same assumption behind the whole Golden Age myth. It assumes there was some pure era when Americans simply didn't buy what they couldn't afford. And there never was. They always did. They just did it with different tools, and each tool solved a piece of the puzzle. The general store ledger let them buy on trust and reputation. The installment plan let them buy specific goods and pay while they use them. The pawnshop and the loan shark, and later the licensed lender, let them borrow cash in an emergency. Layaway let them reserve goods and pay in advance safely. The department store charge plate let them consolidate their purchases and avoid carrying cash. And the credit card, when it finally came, did not invent any of this. It simply took every one of those functions and fused them into a single rectangle of plastic that worked almost everywhere for almost anything, with the borrowing built right in. What the credit card really did was remove the friction and remove the shame. Think about all the frictions that used to stand between a person and a purchase they couldn't afford. You had to be known personally to get credit at the store. You had to accept the risk of repossession with an installment plan. You had to face the loan shark or the pawnbroker in person. You had to wait with layaway until you'd paid it off. You had to use a different card or arrangement at every different kind of business. The credit card swept all of that away. Anonymous, universal, instant, and carrying a balance built right in. And it completed the moral revolution that the sewing machine had started a century before, the slow transformation of debt from a source of private shame into a normal, invisible, everyday part of life. The friction that used to make people hesitate, the friction that used to make debt feel like a serious moral decision, was engineered out of existence, one innovation at a time. And this is what serious historians of consumer credit, scholars like Lendl Calder, who wrote a landmark cultural history of the subject, want us to understand. The story we usually tell about consumer credit is a triumphant one. Credit as the great democratizer, the force that freed the ordinary person from the tyranny of cash, that let a working family have a decent home and a car and a comfortable life instead of waiting decades to save up for each thing. And there is real truth in that story. The installment plan and the credit card genuinely did put the American standard of living within reach of tens of millions of people who could never have paid cash. But that is only half the story, and the celebration conveniently leaves out the other half, which is that this same system also disciplined those millions of people into a lifetime of monthly payments. It bound them to their jobs because you cannot miss a payment if you cannot miss a paycheck. It transferred an enormous and permanent stream of interest from the pockets of working people into the accounts of lenders. The story of consumer credit is not simply the story of freedom, and it is not simply the story of exploitation. It is both at once, tangled together so tightly that you cannot pull them apart. And anyone who tells you it's only one or the other is selling you something. And here's what makes this 100-year story feel so urgent right now, in our own moment, because none of it is over. Look around today and you'll see every single one of these old tools reborn in new clothes. That buy now, pay later button at online checkout, the one that splits your purchase into 4 easy payments, that is the installment plan, the exact idea Edward Clark invented to sell sewing machines in 1856, dressed up in a smartphone app. The payday lender with the storefront on the corner charging desperate people brutal rates for a small advance against their next paycheck. That is the salary lender, the loan shark of a century ago, operating under a different name. The pawn shops are still there. Layaway comes back into fashion every time the economy gets frightening. And the credit card, of course, is now so woven into American life that the average household carries a balance measured in the thousands of dollars, paying interest month after month, often on purchases they've long since forgotten making. The tools evolve, the marketing gets slicker, the friction gets ever lower, but the fundamental human situation has not changed one bit since that farmer stood at the general store counter needing something he couldn't yet pay for, and the storekeeper reached for his ledger. Because in the end, that is the real answer to how Americans bought what they couldn't afford before credit cards. They did it the same way we do it now. They found someone willing to bet that they'd pay it back later, and that someone found a way to make a profit on the wait. The whole glittering, complicated apparatus of modern consumer finance, all of it, from the sewing machine to the loan shark to the Fresno Drop to the app on your phone, is just an endlessly refined answer to one very old and very human question. What do you do when you want something today that you cannot pay for until tomorrow? For more than 100 years, some of the smartest and most ambitious people in America have devoted themselves to answering that question and to profiting from the answer. The credit card was not the beginning of that story. It was the moment the whole thing finally clicked into place. And the story is still being written in easy monthly installments in every one of our lives right now. If you found this deep dive valuable, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps these long, carefully researched videos keep getting made. And if this changed how you think about the money in your own wallet, or if your family has a story about layaway or the old charge plate or buying the first car on time, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.